Henry VIII, the king who broke an empire. The Unexpected Heir. Greenwich Palace stood silent in the grey light of dawn, April 1502. Somewhere in those cold stone passages, a 10-year-old boy was about to have his world shattered. Henry Tudor, Duke of York, second son of King Henry VII, woke that morning as a prince with no particular destiny beyond a comfortable life of privilege and possibility. By nightfall, the crushing weight of an entire kingdom would rest upon his young shoulders. Presidential slaves slowly in those days, carried by exhausted riders through muddy roads and uncertain weather. When the messenger finally reached Greenwich, his horse foam-flecked and trembling, the words he carried would echo through 5 centuries of history. Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne, husband to Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon for barely 5 months, was dead. The sweating sickness had taken him at Ludlow Castle, 6 months before his 16th birthday. The golden heir, carefully groomed and educated to inherit a kingdom, was gone. Propagate was not supposed to be king. This simple fact shaped everything that followed. Born on a warm June day in 1491 at Greenwich Palace, Henry arrived as the second son, the spare, the insurance policy. His father, Henry VII, had seized the throne just 6 years earlier at Bosworth Field, ending decades of civil war between York and Lancaster. The Tudor dynasty was new, fragile, built on the battlefield rather than unquestioned birthright. Everything depended on Arthur. Swallowing Henry grew up in his brother's shadow, but it was not an unhappy shadow. While Arthur bore the burden of expectation, grinding through lessons in statecraft and diplomacy, Henry enjoyed a broader education. He studied theology, mathematics, music, and languages. He learned to joust, to hunt, to dance. Accounts from his childhood describe a boy of remarkable physical prowess, already tall and strong, with red gold hair that caught the light. He possessed a sharp mind that delighted in argument and learning, and a charm that drew people to him like moths to flame. The Tudor court watched Arthur with hopeful anxiety and Henry with bemused affection. One would be king, the other would be something else, perhaps a duke, perhaps a cardinal, perhaps an ornament of the court with titles and lands but no throne. The pressure, the constant scrutiny, the endless preparation, these belonged to Arthur. Henry could simply be brilliant without the weight of a crown pressing down on every action. But Arthur was not well. Some sources claim he was sickly from childhood, others insist he was healthy until the end. The truth lies buried with him in Worcester Cathedral. What we know for certain is that in the spring of 1502, both Arthur and his young bride Catherine fell gravely ill at Ludlow Castle. The sweating sickness struck without warning, a disease that could kill within hours, leaving doctors helpless and families devastated. Catherine recovered after days of fever and delirium. Arthur did not. When the news reached Henry VII, the king reportedly broke down in grief. His queen, Elizabeth of York, tried to comfort him, reminding him they still had Henry, they still had hope. They were both young enough to have more children. Then she left her husband's chambers and collapsed in her own sorrow. The careful plans of years, the negotiations with Spain, the alliance secured through Arthur's marriage, all of it thrown into chaos by a fever no one understood. For 10-year-old Henry, the change was immediate and absolute. He was no longer the spare, he was the heir. Every eye in the kingdom turned toward him. The casual freedom of his childhood evaporated. He was created Duke of Cornwall, the traditional title of the heir apparent. In February 1504, he received the titles Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester. The machinery of the state, which had been calibrated for Arthur, now recalibrated for Henry. His father became impossibly protective. Henry VII had clawed his way to power through exile and war. He had watched his rivals destroyed, his claim constantly questioned. He could not afford to lose another son. The young Prince Henry found himself guarded, monitored, restricted. Where once he had roamed relatively freely through the palaces and hunting grounds, now he moved under constant supervision. One Spanish ambassador complained that he was kept like a girl, rarely allowed to be seen, his activities carefully controlled. But beneath the restrictions, something was building. Henry was growing, in body and in spirit. By his mid-teens, he stood over 6 feet tall, towering over most men of his age. His shoulders broadened, his chest deepened, his strength became legendary. He excelled at every physical pursuit: wrestling, archery, tennis, hunting. In the tilt-yard, he was fearless, his lance striking true more often than not. He was becoming what Arthur had never quite managed to be, a physical specimen that embodied the ideals of Renaissance kingship. More than that, he was developing the personality that would define his reign. He was supremely confident, convinced of his own rightness, charming when he chose to be, and dangerous when crossed. He possessed his father's political instinct, but lacked the caution born of years in exile. Henry had never known true hardship. He had been born into royalty, raised in palaces, educated by the finest tutors. The world, he believed, was meant to bend to his will. During these years, one situation remained unresolved. Catherine of Aragon, Arthur's widow, remained in England. The question of her dowry, her future, her status became a diplomatic tangle. Henry VII wanted to keep the Spanish alliance, but did not want to return Catherine's substantial dowry. One proposed solution was shocking in its audacity. Young Henry could marry his brother's widow. Catherine herself maintained, until her dying day, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. If true, if the marriage had never been completed, then perhaps, with proper dispensation from the Pope, a marriage between Catherine and Henry could proceed. Unrecognized between betrothed to his brother's widow, a woman 5 years his senior, waiting in diplomatic limbo while kings and ambassadors argued over gold and alliances. He could hardly have known that this woman, this arrangement made for political convenience, would one day drive him to tear his kingdom away from Rome and reshape Christianity in England. In April 1509, Henry VII died. The old king, shrewd and careful and haunted by the ghosts of civil war, passed from the world he had fought so hard to control. His 17-year-old son inherited a stable realm, a healthy treasury, and a kingdom weary of the old king's tight-fisted management. The new king, Henry VIII, came to power in a surge of youthful energy and optimism. The people, tired of the dour court of Henry VII, erupted in celebration. Great things were expected of this golden prince, this young giant with the charming smile and athletic grace. He seemed to embody everything a Renaissance monarch should be: handsome, educated, pious, strong, generous where his father had been miserly, open where his father had been secretive. As he rode through London to his coronation, crowds cheered themselves hoarse. Here, at last, was a king who would restore glory to England, who would bring back the days of warrior kings and chivalric splendor. Henry would not disappoint them, but he would shock them. He would give them glory, but the cost would be measured in blood and revolution. The boy who had never expected to be king would become the king no one could forget. The Golden Prince ascends. The coronation took place on June 24, 1509, at Westminster Abbey. London blazed with celebration. Fountains ran with wine instead of water. Bonfires lit the summer night. The young king, just 17 years old, walked through the ancient ceremony with the confidence of someone born to power, even though fate, rather than birthright, had brought him to this moment. Henry VIII began his reign with a gesture that signaled his intentions clearly. Where his father had been suspicious and controlling, Henry would be generous and open. Where his father had avoided the expense of war, Henry dreamed of military glory. Where his father had kept his own counsel, Henry would gather brilliant minds around him and let them shine. His first action was to honor his father's supposed dying wish that he marry Catherine of Aragon. Whether Henry VII had truly expressed such a wish is debatable. What mattered was that it gave Henry political cover for a marriage that solidified the Spanish alliance and brought a substantial dowry. On June 11, 1509, just weeks after his father's death, Henry married Catherine in a modest ceremony at the Friars' Church in Greenwich. The grand coronation followed less than 2 weeks later, and the new queen, now 23 years old, walked beside her young husband into their shared future. They seemed, at first, genuinely happy. Catherine was pious, dignified, well-educated, fluent in multiple languages. She had survived years of uncertainty in England, maintaining her composure through poverty and political limbo. Henry, for his part, appeared genuinely fond of his wife. He called her his true and loving companion, and seemed content with the match. She was an experienced woman to his youthful exuberance, a stabilizing presence to his energetic ambition. The new king threw himself into the role with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. He rose early, attended multiple religious services each day, then spent hours in the tilt-yard or on the tennis court. He hunted with a passion that exhausted his courtiers, riding for hours, sometimes covering 30 miles in a single hunt. He composed music, played multiple instruments, sang in a voice that contemporaries described as beautiful. He wrote poetry and engaged in theological debates with scholars who visited his court. His physical presence dominated every room he entered. At over 6 feet tall, he towered over most men of his age. His shoulders were broad, his legs muscular from constant riding and jousting. His complexion was fair, his hair a reddish gold that seemed to glow in candlelight. Foreign ambassadors wrote home, describing him as the most handsome prince in Christendom. The portraits that survive from his early reign show a young man of startling vitality, lean and confident, with steady eyes that seem to challenge the world. But beneath the pageantry and athleticism, Henry possessed a mind that was both brilliant and dangerous. He had been raised on stories of warrior kings, of Henry V's victory at Agincourt, of Richard the Lionheart's crusading glory. He believed, with the certainty of youth and power, that he was destined for greatness. And he believed that greatness meant war. In 1512, barely 3 years into his reign, Henry joined his father-in-law, King Ferdinand of Aragon, in a war against France. The campaign was a disaster. English troops, poorly supplied and poorly led, achieved nothing of significance. But Henry was undeterred. The following year, 1513, he led an army himself into France. This time, fortune smiled on the young king. His forces captured the town of Terouanne and the city of Tournai. More importantly, while Henry campaigned in France, his forces in England won a stunning victory over invading Scots at Flodden Field, where Scotland's King James IV died alongside thousands of his nobles. Henry returned to England in triumph, his appetite for glory temporarily satisfied. But war, as his more practical advisors tried to explain, was ruinously expensive. The healthy treasury his father had left him was rapidly depleting. The easy victories of 1513 would prove impossible to repeat. Yet Henry had tasted glory, and he would spend much of his reign chasing it, often to the detriment of his kingdom's finances. Managing the young king's ambitions fell largely to one man. Thomas Wolsey, son of an Ipswich butcher, had risen through the church hierarchy through a combination of brilliance, charm, and political instinct. He became royal almoner in 1509, then rapidly ascended to positions of greater power. By 1515, he was Lord Chancellor of England, the king's chief minister, and the most powerful man in the realm after Henry himself. In the same year, he was made a cardinal, and he wielded papal authority in England with an iron hand. Wolsey understood the young king better than anyone. He knew Henry craved glory, but lacked patience for the grinding work of administration. So, Wolsey took on that burden. He managed the kingdom's finances, administered justice in his own court of chancery, negotiated with foreign powers, and generally ran the government while Henry enjoyed the pleasures of kingship. Wolsey grew immensely wealthy in the process, building Hampton Court Palace on a scale that rivaled the king's own residences. His power and ostentation would eventually breed resentment, but for nearly 2 decades, he was indispensable. The relationship between Henry and Wolsey was complex. The king relied on his chief minister, but never fully trusted him. Henry was always the master, Wolsey the servant, no matter how powerful that servant became. When Wolsey's interests aligned with Henry's, all was well. When they diverged, Wolsey would discover just how quickly a king's favour could turn to fury. Through the 1510s and into the 1520s, Henry's court became a centre of Renaissance culture. The king patronised artists and scholars, commissioning works that celebrated his reign and proclaimed his magnificence. Musicians thrived under his patronage, poets dedicated works to him, architects transformed his palaces. The elaborate pageants and tournaments that marked every holiday became legendary for their extravagance. But underneath the splendour, a growing anxiety gnawed at the heart of the Tudor dynasty. Catherine of Aragon was pregnant repeatedly throughout the early years of their marriage, but tragedy followed tragedy. A daughter, born dead in 1510, then, on New Year's Day 1511, a son. The court erupted in celebration. Henry ordered bonfires, tournaments, a magnificent joust. He even participated himself, riding into the tilt-yard with joy written across his face. England had a prince, a male heir, the succession was secure. 52 days later, the infant prince died. The celebrations turned to ashes. Catherine and Henry mourned, but they were young. There would be other children. More pregnancies followed. Stillbirths, miscarriages, infants who lived days or weeks before dying. In 1516, Catherine gave birth to a healthy child who survived. A daughter, Mary. Healthy, intelligent, beloved by both parents, but a daughter nonetheless. In the early 16th century, no woman had successfully ruled England in her own right. The notion of a queen regnant was, to most minds, either impossible or a recipe for disaster. A kingdom needed a king, a warrior who could lead armies and command respect through strength. Henry loved his daughter, but she was not what he needed. He needed a son. As the years passed and Catherine endured more failed pregnancies, Henry's anxiety deepened. He was a young, vital, athletic man, married to a woman who, by the late 1520s, was in her early 40s and clearly past childbearing age. The Tudor dynasty, so recently established, hung by the thread of a single life, his own. If he died without a male heir, England could plunge back into the civil war that had consumed it before his father's victory. The king began to wonder if God was punishing him. Why else would every son die while his daughter lived? What had he done to deserve this divine displeasure? Henry, always theologically minded, turned to Scripture for answers. And in the book of Leviticus, he found a passage that seemed to explain everything. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an impurity. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. Henry had married his brother's widow. Catherine insisted the marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that she had come to Henry as a virgin, that the dispensation granted by Pope Julius II was valid. But what if she was wrong? What if the marriage to Arthur had been real, completed, binding? Then Henry's marriage to Catherine was cursed, forbidden by God's own law. No wonder his sons died. God was punishing him for living in sin. By the mid-1520s, this idea had taken root in Henry's mind and begun to grow like poison ivy, wrapping around every thought and decision. But the catalyst, the spark that would ignite the coming conflagration, walked through the halls of his court in the form of a dark-eyed woman who understood that power lay not in yielding to the king, but in making him wait. The great matter begins. Communicator. Ben Boleyn was not beautiful by the standards of her age. She was too dark, too sharp-featured, too angular. But she possessed something far more dangerous than conventional beauty. She had presence, intelligence, wit, and an understanding of how to capture and hold a king's attention. She had spent years at the French court, serving Queen Claude, absorbing the sophisticated culture and politics of continental Europe. When she returned to England and joined Catherine's household as a lady-in-waiting, she brought that continental polish with her. Henry first noticed her in the mid-1520s. At first, it was likely just another flirtation. The king had taken mistresses before, most notably Elizabeth Blount, who had borne him an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, in 1519. These affairs were discreet, accepted as a king's prerogative. But Anne refused to follow the pattern. She would not become the king's mistress. If Henry wanted her, he would have to marry her. For a king accustomed to getting everything he wanted, Anne's resistance was intoxicating. The letters Henry wrote to her during their courtship survive, passionate declarations that reveal a man truly infatuated, perhaps even in love. But Anne was playing a deeper game. She had watched her sister Mary become the king's mistress and then be cast aside with little to show for it. Anne would not make that mistake. She held out for the ultimate prize, and in doing so, she helped push Henry toward a decision that would reshape Christianity in England. Forging in 1527, Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was invalid, cursed by God, impossible to continue. He needed an annulment. Not a divorce, which would imply the marriage had been real, but an annulment, a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. Pope Julius II had granted a dispensation, allowing the marriage despite Catherine's previous union with Arthur. Now, Henry needed Pope Clement VII to declare that dispensation invalid. Under normal circumstances, Henry might have succeeded. The papacy had granted annulments before, especially to powerful monarchs who could provide compelling theological arguments and, more importantly, political pressure. But 1527 was not a normal time. In May of that year, the armies of Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, sacked Rome in an orgy of violence that shocked Europe. Clement fled for his life, eventually becoming little more than Charles's prisoner. The Pope could not grant Henry's annulment without enraging the emperor who controlled his fate. Cardinal Wolsey was tasked with solving this problem. For 2 years, he deployed every tool of diplomacy and every ounce of his considerable skill. He proposed that a special court be held in England to decide the matter. Pope Clement, trying to buy time and avoid making a decision that would anger either Henry or Charles, sent Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio to England to investigate. In June 1529, the court convened at Blackfriars in London. Henry and Catherine were both summoned. The king attended, confident that the court would rule in his favor. When Catherine's name was called, she rose from her seat, walked across the hall, and knelt before her husband. What followed was one of the most dramatic speeches in English history. Punished, speaking in accented English so that all could understand, defended herself and her marriage with a passion that moved many to tears. She insisted that she had come to Henry as a virgin, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that their union was blessed by God and valid in every way. She begged Henry on her knees to consider their daughter, their years together, the love they had shared. When she finished, she rose, curtsied to the king, and walked from the hall. When called back, she refused to return. She would not dignify this proceeding with her presence any longer. The court at Blackfriars eventually accomplished nothing. Campeggio, following instructions from Rome, delayed and obfuscated until Clement could recall the case to Rome, where it would languish indefinitely. Henry was furious. Wolsey, despite all his efforts, had failed to deliver what the king needed most. The cardinal's fall from power was swift and brutal. Stripped of his position as Lord Chancellor, accused of treason, arrested, he died on the journey to London to face trial. The man who had been second only to the king died disgraced and broken. Into the void left by Wolsey's fall stepped a new man with a new approach. Thomas Cromwell, son of a blacksmith, lawyer, merchant, fixer, possessed a ruthless pragmatism that made Wolsey's political maneuvering look gentle. Cromwell understood that if the Pope would not grant Henry his annulment, then England would simply have to stop caring what the Pope thought. The idea was radical, revolutionary, almost heretical. For 1,000 years, England had been part of Catholic Christendom, acknowledging the Pope as Christ's vicar on earth, the supreme spiritual authority. To break from Rome was to risk war, excommunication, isolation. But Cromwell saw an opportunity. If Henry became head of the Church in England, he could grant his own annulment. More importantly, the wealth of the Church, the lands and gold and property held by monasteries and bishoprics, could be seized for the crown. Annulment, and intrigued by the prospect of increased power and wealth, was persuaded. Between 1532 and 1534, a series of acts passed through Parliament that systematically dismantled papal authority in England and constructed a new religious structure with the king at its head. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, passed in 1533, declared that England was an empire unto itself, subject to no foreign power, spiritual or temporal. This act prevented Catherine from appealing to Rome for support. The Act of Succession, passed in 1534, declared Mary illegitimate and established that Anne Boleyn's children were the rightful heirs. All subjects were required to swear an oath accepting this. The Act of Supremacy, passed in November 1534, made explicit what the previous acts had implied. Henry Tudor was, and had always been, the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England. The medieval understanding that spiritual authority rested with the Pope and temporal authority with kings was legislated out of existence. Church and state were now one, with Henry controlling both. The revolution was accomplished through law rather than violence, which made it no less dramatic. Those who refused to accept the new order faced charges of treason. Sir Thomas More, former Lord Chancellor, brilliant scholar, Henry's friend, refused to swear the oath accepting the king's supremacy over the church. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, tried, convicted, and beheaded in July 1535. Bishop John Fisher, the only bishop to openly oppose Henry, met the same fate weeks earlier. As More walked to the scaffold, he reportedly said he died, "the king's good servant, but God's first." His execution shocked Catholic Europe and confirmed what many feared. Henry VIII, once called Defender of the Faith by the Pope for his writings against Martin Luther, had become a schismatic, a heretic, a tyrant who would kill anyone who stood in his way. But Henry did not see himself as a villain. He believed, with absolute conviction, that he was right. God had cursed his marriage to Catherine. The evidence was clear in the deaths of his sons. The Pope had refused to acknowledge this obvious truth, so the Pope was wrong. Henry's cause was just, his actions necessary, his conscience clear. That others died for disagreeing was their choice, their refusal to see reason. In January 1533, months before the Act in Restraint of Appeals made it legal, Henry married Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony. She was already pregnant. By the time Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury appointed by Henry, declared the marriage to Catherine invalid in May 1533, Anne was heavy with child. On June 1st, Anne was crowned Queen in a magnificent ceremony. On September 7th, 1533, she gave birth to a healthy child, a daughter. They named her Elizabeth. The king's disappointment was crushing. He had broken with Rome, defied Catholic Europe, executed his friends, revolutionized the church, all to marry Anne and secure a male heir. And she had given him another daughter. Anne assured him there would be sons to follow. She had proven she could bear healthy children. The next would surely be a boy. Confiscated eventually ended in miscarriage, and the one after that. By 1536, Henry's passion for Anne had curdled into resentment. She had not delivered what he needed. She was sharp-tongued where Catherine had been gentle, argumentative where Catherine had been submissive. The king began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. Pensions. In the tilt yard at Greenwich, during a tournament held to celebrate January 1536, Henry suffered the accident that would change everything. The turning point and the wheel of queens. The armor Henry wore that day weighed approximately 50 kilograms, perhaps more. It was a magnificent creation, steel plates intricately worked and jointed, protecting him from shoulder to ankle. With his lance raised, his horse charging at full gallop, he was a sight that thrilled spectators and terrified opponents. Jousting was dangerous, even in the best circumstances. Men died in the tilt yard, crushed when horses fell, or impaled by splintered lances. But Henry was skilled, experienced, fearless. He had jousted since his youth without serious injury. Invoked next unfolded in seconds, but its consequences would last decades. His opponent's lance struck him. The blow unseated him, he fell. His massive warhorse, unable to stop, fell on top of him. For 2 hours, the King of England lay unconscious, crushed beneath steel and horseflesh, while his court held its collective breath and prayed. When Henry finally regained consciousness, he seemed at first to have survived relatively unscathed. But the damage was done. The weight of the horse and armor had reopened old injuries to his legs, creating ulcers that would never properly heal. More ominously, modern medical analysis of contemporary accounts suggests that Henry likely suffered traumatic brain injury from the fall. The personality changes that followed, the increasing paranoia, the sudden rages, the growing cruelty, all align with symptoms of serious head trauma. The news of the accident reached Anne Boleyn while she was pregnant. The shock of learning her husband nearly died, combined with whatever other pressures she faced, triggered a miscarriage. The lost child was male. Anne had miscarried the son Henry desperately needed, and in the king's mind, this was yet another sign that God disapproved of his choices. Henry's affection for Anne, already strained, evaporated. By the spring of 1536, factions at court who hated Anne saw an opportunity. Charges were manufactured with frightening speed. Anne was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn. The accusations were almost certainly false, constructed by Cromwell to give the king what he wanted, an exit from this marriage. Anne and the men accused with her were arrested and brought to the Tower. The trials were shams, the verdicts predetermined. One by one, the accused men were executed. Then, on May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, was led out to Tower Green. At Henry's mercy, she had been granted a small favour. Instead of the traditional axe, an expert swordsman had been brought from France to carry out the execution. It was said to be quicker, cleaner, less likely to require multiple blows. Pennsylvania faced death with remarkable courage. She made a short speech, carefully worded to avoid giving offense, maintaining her innocence while acknowledging the king's judgment. She knelt, tied a blindfold over her eyes, and spoke her final prayer. Executioner struck. A single blow. Anne Boleyn, who had fascinated a king and changed the religion of a kingdom, died at the age of 35 or 36. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. Jane had served as lady-in-waiting to both Catherine and Anne. Her family, ambitious and ruthless, had positioned her carefully in the king's sight. Where Anne had been dark and sharp, Jane was fair and gentle. Where Anne had argued, Jane submitted. She represented, in Henry's mind, a return to the proper order of things. A quiet, obedient wife who would give him sons and not challenge his authority. On October 12, 1537, after a long and difficult labour, Jane gave birth to a healthy boy. They named him Edward. The kingdom erupted in celebration. Bonfires blazed, church bells rang, wine flowed freely. Henry finally had his legitimate male heir. God had finally blessed him. The boy was christened with enormous ceremony 3 days later, with both of his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, participating despite their declared illegitimacy. 12 days after giving birth, Jane Seymour died. The official cause was listed as complications from childbirth, likely puerperal fever, an infection that killed countless women in that era. Henry, who had shown so little mercy to Catherine and Anne, genuinely mourned Jane. She had given him what the others could not. She was the only one of his 6 wives he requested be buried beside him when his own time came. For 2 years after Jane's death, Henry remained unmarried. His ministers urged him to seek another wife, to secure the succession further, but Henry seemed genuinely grief-stricken. When he did agree to marry again, it was for political rather than romantic reasons. Cromwell, ever the strategist, arranged a match with Anne of Cleves, daughter of a German duke, to secure Protestant alliances against Catholic powers threatening England. The portrait Hans Holbein painted of Anne showed a woman who seemed pleasant enough. But when Anne arrived in England in late 1539, Henry was horrified. He found her physically repellent, or so he claimed. Whether Anne was truly unattractive, or whether Henry, now almost 50 years old, obese and plagued by pain from his leg ulcers, simply could not perform with a woman who did not excite him, the result was the same. The marriage was never consummated. Within 6 months, Henry had the marriage annulled. Anne, showing considerably more wisdom than either Catherine or Anne Boleyn, agreed to the annulment without protest. Henry rewarded her cooperation with a generous settlement, estates and income that made her one of the wealthiest women in England. She lived comfortably until her death in 1557, outliving Henry and all his other wives. She was perhaps the smartest of them all, knowing when to yield rather than fight. Cromwell, who had arranged the disastrous marriage, paid the price. Henry had him arrested, charged with treason, and executed in July 1540. The same month, the king married Catherine Howard, a cousin of Anne Boleyn, barely 20 years old, vivacious and pretty, and completely unprepared for the scrutiny and danger of being Henry's queen. For a time, Henry seemed rejuvenated. He showered Catherine with gifts, called her his rose without a thorn, acted like a man half his age courting his first love. But Catherine was young and foolish. Whether she actually committed adultery or had merely been indiscreet before her marriage, evidence emerged in late 1541 that destroyed her. Henry, when informed, reportedly wept with rage and humiliation. Catherine Howard was executed on February 13, 1542. She walked to the block, terrified, crying, barely able to stand. She was perhaps 19 years old. 2 of Henry's 6 wives had now lost their heads, both cousins, both accused of adultery. The pattern was clear. When Henry tired of a wife, she became expendable. His final marriage, in July 1543, was to Catherine Parr, a twice-widowed woman in her 30s, intelligent, educated, and deeply religious. She had been romantically involved with Thomas Seymour, brother of Jane Seymour, when Henry decided he wanted her. She could hardly refuse a king's proposal. Catherine Parr proved to be exactly what the aging, sick king needed. She was a skilled nurse, managing his medical care with patience and competence. She was a good stepmother to his 3 children, building relationships with Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, despite the complex dynamics of their situation. She was the first Queen of England to publish books under her own name, writing devotional works that revealed a sharp, theological mind. She also came perilously close to losing her head. Her Protestant sympathies made enemies at court, and those enemies convinced Henry that she was guilty of heresy. Warrants were drawn up for her arrest. Catherine, learning of the plot, went to Henry and abased herself completely, insisting she had only discussed theology to distract the king from his pain, that she deferred to his superior wisdom in all things. Henry, mollified, dismissed the charges. Catherine had learned what survival required. By the time Catherine became his sixth wife, Henry was a shadow of the Golden Prince who had ascended the throne in 1509. He was massively obese, his waist measuring over 50 inches. The ulcers on his legs oozed constantly, needing to be drained and cauterized regularly, filling rooms with the smell of rotting flesh. He could no longer walk and had to be carried in a special chair by sturdy men. His temper was unpredictable, his rages terrifying. The physical and mental decline that had begun with the jousting accident in 1536 had accelerated into a catastrophic collapse. Yet even in this state, he remained formidable. He was still king, his word was still law, and he was still capable of ordering executions with the casual ease of someone ordering dinner. His final years would see more deaths, more wars, more desperate attempts to secure the legacy he had sacrificed so much to create. The Reformation's price. The dissolution of the monasteries began in 1536, accelerated through 1537 and 1538, and was essentially complete by 1540. It was the most dramatic redistribution of property in English history since the Norman conquest. Over 800 monasteries, priories, convents, and friaries were closed. Their lands, which comprised perhaps a quarter of all agricultural land in England, were seized by the crown. Their treasures, the accumulated wealth of centuries, were melted down or sold. Their libraries were scattered or destroyed. The official justification was reform. Cromwell and his agents produced reports documenting corruption, vice, and laziness among the monks and nuns. Some of these reports were genuine. Many were exaggerated or fabricated. But the real reason was simpler. Henry needed money. Wars were expensive. The break with Rome had cut off certain revenues. The wealth of the church was enormous. By dissolving the monasteries, Henry gained both immediate treasure and long-term income from the lands. The human cost was substantial. Thousands of monks and nuns, many of whom had entered religious life as children and knew nothing else, were turned out with small pensions that often barely supported them. The communities that had grown up around monasteries, dependent on them for employment, charity, and social services, found themselves adrift. The monasteries had been centers of education, hospitals, providers of food and shelter for the poor. All of this ended virtually overnight. For some of the nobility and gentry, the dissolution was an opportunity. Henry sold much of the seized land to raise quick money, and those who bought it became stakeholders in the new order. They would resist any attempt to restore Catholic power because it would mean losing their property. This was brilliant politics. By spreading the wealth of the church throughout the kingdom's elite, Henry ensured that they had a vested interest in maintaining his religious settlement. But not everyone accepted the changes quietly. In October 1536, a massive uprising erupted in the north of England. Known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, it began in Lincolnshire and spread through Yorkshire and other northern counties. At its height, perhaps 40,000 people, from peasants to nobility, marched under banners bearing the 5 wounds of Christ, demanding the restoration of the monasteries, the removal of heretical bishops, and a return to Catholic practices. Discharged was led by Robert Aske, a lawyer, who managed to organize the disparate groups into a formidable force. For a time, the Pilgrimage of Grace controlled much of northern England. Henry, caught off guard by the scale of the uprising, used diplomacy to buy time. He promised to address the rebels' grievances, to hold a parliament in the north, to grant pardons to all who dispersed peacefully. The rebels, trusting the king's word, went home. It was the last mistake many of them would make. Henry, once the threat had passed, showed his true nature. The promises were broken. Leaders were arrested. Show trials were held. Robert Aske was hanged in chains at York until he died, his body left to rot as a warning. Lords were executed for treason. In total, somewhere between 150 and 200 people were executed in the aftermath of the Pilgrimage of Grace. Psychologist was clear. Resistance was futile. The old ways were gone. Anyone who refused to accept the new order would be destroyed. Henry had broken with Rome, remade the church, dissolved the monasteries, and crushed the largest rebellion of his reign. The Reformation in England was secured, not through persuasion or genuine religious fervour among the masses, but through the ruthless application of royal power. Punished, it is worth noting that Henry himself remained, in many ways, theologically conservative. He did not embrace Protestantism the way his son Edward would. He still believed in transubstantiation, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He still opposed clerical marriage, still valued most Catholic rituals and traditions. What Henry rejected was papal authority, not Catholic doctrine. He wanted to be both Catholic and supreme head of his own church, a contradictory position that confused many. For hygiene, made life dangerous papal authority were traitors. Protestants who rejected too much Catholic doctrine were heretics. The middle ground shifted constantly, depending on Henry's mood and political calculations. People burned at the stake for being too Protestant, people hanged for being too Catholic. The religious landscape of England became a minefield where a wrong word could mean death. One man who understood this better than most was Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer was genuinely Protestant in his beliefs, but he was also pragmatic. He pushed reform as far as Henry would allow, but no further. He drafted the 10 Articles and the 6 Articles, the official statements of English religious doctrine, navigating the impossible task of satisfying both Protestant reformers and Catholic conservatives. He survived where others fell because he understood how to read the king's will and bend to it without breaking himself. The greatest service Cranmer provided Henry was in granting the annulments and validating the marriages. He declared the marriage to Catherine invalid. He annulled the marriage to Anne Boleyn 2 days before her execution. He annulled the marriage to Anne of Cleves. Every time Henry needed the church to legitimize his desires, Cranmer delivered. It was a devil's bargain, but it kept Cranmer alive and in power, and it allowed him to push Protestant reforms that would flower fully under Edward VI. The religious revolution Henry initiated was more than just a change in church governance. It fundamentally altered English society. The educated classes began reading the Bible in English rather than Latin, making scripture accessible in ways it had never been before. The Great Bible, ordered placed in every parish church by 1539, allowed ordinary people to encounter religious texts directly rather than through priests. This democratization of scripture would have profound effects on English literature, thought, and culture. The dissolution of the monasteries changed the physical landscape. Great buildings that had stood for centuries were demolished, their stone carted away to build manor houses for newly wealthy gentry. The ruins that remain today, abbeys like Fountains or Glastonbury, are romantic and picturesque now, but in the 1540s they were fresh wounds on the countryside, symbols of a world destroyed. And through it all, Henry remained convinced of his righteousness. He had defied the Pope to obey God. He had reformed the Church to purify it. The people who died, from Thomas More to the nameless monks turned out of their cloisters, were casualties of necessary change. Henry could not see himself as a tyrant because, in his mind, everything he did was in service of a higher purpose. The good of the kingdom, the security of the succession, the proper relationship between church and state, these justified any action, any sacrifice. The irony would not become clear until after his death. The religious settlement he imposed, the middle way between Catholic and Protestant, satisfied no one completely. His son Edward would push England sharply toward Protestantism. His daughter Mary would try to restore Catholicism. Only Elizabeth, his second daughter, would find a way to create a lasting settlement, and even that would involve compromises and conflicts that lasted for generations. Henry broke the church to serve his own needs, but what emerged from that breaking was not what he intended. He wanted to remain Catholic without the Pope. What he created was the foundation for English Protestantism, for religious pluralism, for the idea that the state could determine religious practice. The consequences of his actions would shape not just England, but the entire English-speaking world, including the nascent colonies in North America that would one day become a nation built on the principle of religious freedom. The failing body, the iron will. By the early 1540s, Henry's physical decline had become impossible to hide. The jousting accident of 1536 had been the beginning, but the deterioration had accelerated. The leg ulcers that had appeared after the fall never healed. They grew worse, festering wounds that needed constant attention. Doctors drained them regularly, cauterizing the flesh to prevent them from closing over and trapping infection inside. The pain must have been extraordinary. No effective painkillers existed. Henry endured, day after day, the torment of rotting flesh and brutal medical procedures. The ulcers meant he could no longer exercise as he once had. The athletic prince who had jousted and hunted and played tennis for hours was gone. Henry could barely walk. By the mid-1540s, he needed to be carried in a specially constructed chair by strong men. Staircases in his palaces were modified with ramps and mechanical devices to lift him from floor to floor. When he travelled, it required enormous planning and effort. Unable to exercise, eating the same massive amounts of food he had always consumed, Henry grew grotesquely obese. Armour made for him in 1514 shows a waist of 35 inches and a chest of 42 inches, the proportions of an athlete. Armour from the 1540s shows a waist exceeding 52 inches. Estimates put his weight at well over 300 pounds. His face, once handsome, became bloated and jowly. His legs, grotesquely swollen, could barely support him on the rare occasions he tried to stand. The leg ulcers were not his only medical problems. He likely suffered from type 2 diabetes, caused by his obesity and terrible diet. He showed signs of heart disease. He may have had gout. Contemporary accounts describe him suffering from terrible headaches, possibly migraines, possibly related to the head trauma from the 1536 accident. He had bouts of fever when the leg ulcers became infected. He experienced periods of depression and paranoia that may have been psychological or may have resulted from his various physical ailments affecting his brain chemistry. His personality, never stable even in his youth, became dangerously erratic. He would fly into rages over minor provocations, screaming at courtiers, threatening executions. Then, just as suddenly, he would become maudlin and affectionate. His paranoia intensified. He saw plots everywhere, conspiracies against him, heretics and traitors lurking in every corner. And given the power he wielded, his paranoia translated directly into death warrants. Phantom. The list of those executed during Henry's reign is staggering. By conservative estimates, around 70,000 people were executed during his rule, though this number includes common criminals as well as those who died for religious or political reasons. Among the more notable victims were two of his wives, several of his closest advisors, numerous nobles, clergy who disagreed with his religious policies, and countless others whose names history has forgotten. Each execution followed legal forms. Henry was careful about that. He did not simply murder people, he had them tried and convicted, usually of treason or heresy. The trials were often shams with predetermined outcomes, but they provided a veneer of legality that salved whatever remained of Henry's conscience. He was not a murderer. He was a king dispensing justice. That the justice almost always happened to align with his desires was, in his view, evidence of his rightness. Yet, amid the physical decay and mental instability, Henry's political instincts remained sharp. He understood power and how to wield it. He knew when to compromise and when to crush opposition. He managed to navigate the treacherous waters of European politics, playing France and the Holy Roman Empire against each other, maintaining England's independence and relative security despite the religious upheaval he had caused. In 1542, Henry launched another war against Scotland. The Scots, allied with France and still Catholic, were a constant threat on England's northern border. At the Battle of Solway Moss in November 1542, English forces won a crushing victory. The Scottish king, James V, died shortly after, leaving his infant daughter Mary as queen. Henry saw an opportunity. If his son Edward could marry Mary, Queen of Scots, England and Scotland could be united peacefully. The plan would ultimately fail, leading to decades of conflict, but it showed Henry still thinking strategically about England's long-term security. Henry launched yet another war against France. This time, he actually led his army across the Channel, the first time he had personally commanded troops since 1513. His obesity and illness made the journey difficult, but Henry was determined. English forces laid siege to Boulogne and captured it in September 1544. Henry considered it a great victory, though the military reality was more complex. The campaign was ruinously expensive and achieved little strategic value. But Henry had his triumph, and he returned to England satisfied. The cost of these wars was enormous. The healthy treasury his father had left him was long gone. The wealth from the dissolved monasteries had been spent. Henry resorted to debasing the coinage, reducing the gold and silver content of English coins and making up the difference with base metals. This brought short-term profit, but caused devastating long-term inflation. Prices rose sharply, hurting ordinary people while enriching those who understood how to profit from currency manipulation. Henry's final years were dominated by three concerns: his health, his wars, and his succession. Catherine Parr managed the first with skill and patience, nursing the king through his ailments as well as anyone could. The wars eventually wound down as Henry's treasury emptied and his body weakened. But the succession haunted him. Edward was healthy and well-educated, trained in all the arts of kingship. But he was only 9 years old when Henry died. If Henry died before Edward came of age, a regency would be necessary. Who would control that regency? The factions at court, Protestant and Catholic, Reformist and Conservative, eyed each other with hostility. Henry tried to balance them, appointing a council of executors to govern in Edward's name, but he knew the balance would not hold. Mary, his elder daughter, remained Catholic despite all pressure to convert. She was stubborn, much like her mother Catherine of Aragon, and Henry grudgingly respected her for it, even as it frustrated him. She was included in the succession after Edward, restored to legitimacy by the Third Succession Act of 1544. But Henry worried about what would happen if she inherited the throne. Would she try to undo everything he had built? Elizabeth, his younger daughter, was proving to be remarkably intelligent and adaptable. She seemed Protestant in belief, but careful about expressing it. She navigated the dangerous waters of Henry's court with a skill beyond her years. Henry saw potential in her, but she was still a girl, still young, still of questionable legitimacy in the eyes of many Europeans who had never accepted his break with Rome. In his will, Henry laid out the succession clearly. Edward would inherit first. If Edward died without heirs, Mary would inherit. If Mary died without heirs, Elizabeth would inherit. Only if all three died without children would the crown pass to the descendants of Henry's younger sister Mary, specifically the Grey family. His elder sister Margaret's descendants, including Mary, Queen of Scots, were explicitly excluded, perhaps because Henry did not trust the Scots. The will also confirmed Henry's religious settlement. The Church of England was to remain independent of Rome, but Catholic in most practices. Reforms were to continue cautiously. The monasteries would not be restored. All these provisions would be tested almost immediately after Henry's death, as Edward's Protestant advisors pushed radical reforms, and Mary later tried to restore Catholicism completely. As 1546 turned to 1547, Henry knew his time was running short. The pain was constant. The fevers came more frequently. He had good days when he could conduct business, and bad days when he could barely stay conscious. But he clung to power, clung to life, unwilling to release his grip on the kingdom he had transformed so completely. On January 27, 1547, Henry's condition worsened dramatically. He took to his bed at Whitehall Palace. His doctors and counsellors attended him. He received communion, the last rites of the church he headed. As night fell, he drifted in and out of consciousness. At some point in the early hours of January 28th, someone finally had the courage to tell the king he was dying. It was treason to predict the monarch's death, but there was no avoiding it now. Unchecked, Henry, lucid for a moment, nodded. He asked for Archbishop Cranmer. By the time Cranmer arrived, Henry could no longer speak. Cranmer asked the king to give some sign that he died in the faith of Christ. Henry squeezed Cranmer's hand as hard as he could. Then, shortly before 2 in the morning, Henry VIII, King of England, Ireland, and France, defender of the faith, supreme head of the Church of England, died. He was 55 years old. For 10 days, his death was kept secret, while arrangements were made and the transition of power organized. When the news was finally announced, reactions were mixed. Some mourned the passing of a great king. Others breathed sighs of relief that the tyrant was finally gone. Most simply wondered what would come next. Henry was buried at Windsor Castle in St. George's Chapel, next to Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his son. The elaborate tomb he had planned for himself, incorporating elements stolen from Cardinal Wolsey's tomb, was never completed. His body rests in a vault under the choir, a simple stone in the floor marking the spot. It is, in its way, fitting. Henry's legacy was never going to be a monument of marble and gold. His legacy was England itself, transformed utterly by his will. The children who inherited England. Edward VI was 9 years old when his father died. The news was broken to him and his half-sister Elizabeth together. Both children burst into tears, clinging to each other. For Edward, childhood effectively ended that day. He was now king, and a kingdom in religious and political turmoil awaited him. The Regency Council his father had appointed quickly proved unworkable. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, Jane Seymour's brother, and thus Edward's uncle, maneuvered himself into the position of Lord Protector, effectively ruling in the young king's name. Seymour, now Duke of Somerset, was a convinced Protestant who saw Edward's reign as an opportunity to complete the Reformation Henry had started but never finished. The 6 years of Edward's reign saw England lurch dramatically toward Protestantism. The Book of Common Prayer, written largely by Archbishop Cranmer, replaced the Latin Mass with English services. Priests were allowed to marry. Images in churches were destroyed. The doctrines that Henry had maintained, transubstantiation and other Catholic beliefs, were explicitly rejected. England was becoming a Protestant nation in ways Henry had never intended. Edward himself was deeply committed to Protestant reform. His tutors had educated him in evangelical theology. He wrote religious treatises and debated fine points of doctrine with a seriousness unusual for a child. He genuinely believed that Catholic practices were sinful and that his duty as king was to purify the church his father had created. But Edward's health was never robust. Contemporary descriptions suggest he was a sickly child, pale and thin. In early 1553, he fell ill with what was probably tuberculosis. As it became clear he would not survive, Edward and his Protestant counsellors faced a crisis. If Edward died without children, his sister Mary would inherit. Mary was fiercely Catholic. She would undo all the Protestant reforms. England might even return to papal authority. In a desperate gamble, Edward and the Duke of Northumberland, who had replaced Somerset as the power behind the throne, altered the succession. Ignoring Henry VIII's will and parliamentary statute, Edward named his cousin Lady Jane Grey as his heir. Jane was Protestant, educated, and descended from Henry VIII's sister, Mary. Most importantly, she was married to Northumberland's son, which meant Northumberland could continue to wield power. Edward died on July 6, 1553, at the age of 15. Jane was proclaimed queen. For 9 days, England had a queen who had never wanted the throne. Then Mary, supported by popular sentiment and the law, marched on London with an army. Jane's support evaporated. She was deposed, arrested, and later executed. Mary I became queen. Mary was 37 years old when she inherited the throne, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a woman who had spent her entire life fighting for her legitimacy and her mother's honor. She was brilliant, devout, and absolutely convinced that God had placed her on the throne to restore England to Catholicism. She married Philip II of Spain, hoping to secure Catholic support and produce a Catholic heir. The marriage was deeply unpopular in England. People feared Spanish domination. When Mary announced she was pregnant, many hoped for an heir that would secure the succession, but no child ever came. Modern historians believe Mary may have been suffering from ovarian cancer, and what she thought were pregnancies were symptoms of disease. Monarch's reign is remembered primarily for the religious persecutions. Determined to root out heresy, she reinstituted laws against heretics and began burning Protestants at the stake. Over the course of her 5-year reign, approximately 300 people were executed for religious beliefs. Bishops and commoners alike burned. The smoke from Smithfield and other execution sites became a symbol of Mary's reign. Her Protestant enemies called her Bloody Mary, a nickname that stuck. She died on November 17, 1558, probably from cancer, having failed to produce an heir, having failed to reconcile England to Rome, having failed to prevent her Protestant sister from inheriting the throne. On her deathbed, she finally acknowledged Elizabeth as her successor. Confiscated Elizabeth was 25 when she became queen. She had survived the dangerous reigns of her brother and sister through a combination of intelligence, caution, and luck. She had been imprisoned in the Tower during Mary's reign, suspected of involvement in Protestant plots. She had walked the edge of a knife for years, never quite giving her enemies enough evidence to destroy her, never quite alienating those who might protect her. To be one of the most skilled monarchs England ever had. She navigated the religious conflicts by creating what became known as the Elizabethan settlement, a middle way between Catholic and Protestant that satisfied neither extreme but allowed most people to live in relative peace. The Book of Common Prayer was restored, but Catholic elements were maintained. Conformity in public was required, but private beliefs were not aggressively policed. She refused to marry, despite constant pressure from Parliament and her councillors. Some historians believe she was romantically attached to Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, but could not marry him because of scandals surrounding his wife's death. Others believe she simply understood that marriage would mean ceding power to a husband, and Elizabeth had no intention of sharing her throne. She became the Virgin Queen, married only to England. Her reign lasted 45 years. It saw the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, establishing England as a significant naval power. It saw the flowering of English literature with Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spenser. It saw the beginning of English colonization in the New World. Elizabethan age became synonymous with a golden era of English culture and power. When Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, she left no heir. The Tudor dynasty died with her. The throne passed to James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. The succession Henry had worried so much about had ultimately passed out of his direct line to the descendants of his sister Margaret, whom he had explicitly excluded. Turquoise is rich. Henry had broken with Rome, revolutionized the church, married 6 times, executed 2 wives, all in pursuit of a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. He got his male heir in Edward, but Edward died childless at 15. His daughter Mary tried to restore Catholicism and died childless. His daughter Elizabeth, whom he had once declared illegitimate, became the greatest Tudor monarch and also died childless. The dynasty ended not with Henry's descendants, but with his great-nephew. Yet in another sense, Henry's legacy did endure. The Church of England persisted. Parliamentary power, which Henry had expanded to achieve his religious reforms, continued to grow until it eventually superseded the monarchy. The break from Rome, which had seemed so radical in the 1530s, became permanent. The dissolution of the monasteries redistributed wealth and power in ways that shaped English society for centuries. All 3 of Henry's children were remarkable people in their own right. Edward was learned beyond his years, earnest in his faith, though ultimately too young and sick to fully shape his reign. Mary was courageous and principled, though her methods tarnished her reputation irreparably. Elizabeth was perhaps the finest example of Renaissance monarchy, pragmatic, intelligent, capable of inspiring deep loyalty while maintaining emotional distance. They were products of their father's choices, for good and ill. Edward's Protestant fervour was a reaction to the religious confusion Henry had created. Mary's desperate attempt to restore Catholicism was driven by witnessing her mother's suffering and her own struggle for legitimacy. Elizabeth's careful balancing act came from surviving the chaos of her father's court and her siblings' reigns. Henry had shaped them all, even those he barely knew. Edward was raised in luxury and learning, but in the shadow of Henry's immense personality. Mary spent years separated from her mother, declared illegitimate, fighting for recognition. Elizabeth spent her childhood with shifting status, sometimes princess, sometimes bastard, always in potential danger. They were Henry's children, but they were also survivors of Henry, and that survival shaped who they became as rulers. The legacy that cannot die. The tomb Henry planned for himself was never completed. The massive sarcophagus intended for his remains, originally made for Cardinal Wolsey before his fall, eventually was used for Lord Nelson in St. Paul's Cathedral. Henry rests instead in a simple vault beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, beside Jane Seymour. There is no elaborate monument, no towering memorial declaring his greatness, just a stone in the floor with his name. Perhaps this is fitting. Henry's real monument is not marble or bronze, it is England itself, the nation he transformed so completely that the effects still resonate more than 5 centuries after his death. The Church of England, the Anglican Communion, is Henry's most obvious legacy. Created to serve his personal needs, it evolved into something far more significant. Today, it is one of the largest Christian denominations in the world, with churches in over 165 countries and approximately 85 million members. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the position Henry gave to Thomas Cranmer to grant him his first annulment, remains one of the most influential religious leaders globally. The religious pluralism that would eventually characterize the English-speaking world has its roots in Henry's break with Rome. By asserting that the monarch could determine religious practice within his realm, Henry inadvertently opened the door to the idea that religious authority was not absolute. If one man could create his own church, why not others? The proliferation of Protestant denominations that followed, and eventually the concept of religious freedom enshrined in documents like the American Bill of Rights, can trace a direct line back to Henry's defiance of the Pope. The expansion of parliamentary power that Henry initiated to achieve his religious reforms had profound political consequences. By using Parliament to pass the acts that created the Church of England and dissolved the monasteries, Henry elevated Parliament from an occasional advisory body to a co-equal branch of government. This planted the seeds for the constitutional conflicts of the 17th century and eventually for parliamentary democracy. The English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the gradual evolution toward constitutional monarchy, all had their origins in Henry's decision to rule through parliamentary statute. The dissolution of the monasteries fundamentally altered English society and economy. The redistribution of monastic lands created a new class of landowners, the gentry, who would become the backbone of English politics and society for centuries. The destruction of the monasteries also meant the loss of social services they had provided, creating problems of poverty and education that would take generations to address. But it also broke the Church's monopoly on wealth and learning, secularizing large portions of English life. Henry's military legacy, particularly his expansion of the Royal Navy, shaped England's future as a maritime power. The navy he built formed the foundation for the fleets that would defeat the Spanish Armada under Elizabeth, dominate the seas in the 18th century, and build the British Empire. The Mary Rose, Henry's magnificent flagship that sank in 1545, was raised from the Solent in 1982 and now sits in a museum in Portsmouth, a tangible link to Henry's naval ambitions. His cultural legacy is more complex. Henry was a patron of the arts in his early years, and the Tudor court under his rule attracted artists, musicians, and scholars from across Europe. But his later years saw destruction as well as creation. The dissolution of the monasteries led to the loss or destruction of countless medieval manuscripts, works of art, and architectural treasures. Some of England's most beautiful monastic ruins, like Fountains Abbey or Tintern Abbey, are ruins precisely because Henry's agents stripped them of wealth and left them to decay. Perhaps most significantly, Henry transformed the English monarchy itself. Before his reign, the king was powerful but constrained by tradition, by the church, by feudal obligations. Henry pushed royal power to its limits, asserting divine right, claiming supremacy over church and state, executing anyone who challenged him. He created a template for absolute monarchy that his successors would try to follow. But he also sowed the seeds of monarchy's eventual decline by making royal power dependent on Parliament and by provoking conflicts that would eventually limit royal prerogatives. Barred, the historical memory of Henry is itself contested. For centuries, Protestant England lionized him as the king who freed England from papal tyranny. Catholic historians portrayed him as a tyrant and heretic who brought suffering and religious chaos. Modern historians try to navigate between these extremes, seeing Henry as a complex figure, sometimes brilliant, sometimes brutal, always dominating. For popular imagination is fascinated by Henry in ways that few other historical figures match. His 6 wives, remembered in the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, have captured imaginations for centuries. His larger-than-life personality, his transformation from athletic young prince to obese tyrant, his religious revolution, his multiple marriages, all make for compelling drama. Films, television series, novels, plays, musicals, all continue to draw on Henry's life for material. What drives this endless fascination? Perhaps it is the human scale of his flaws. Henry was not a distant historical figure, but a man whose appetites, ambitions, and emotions shaped the world. His need for a male heir, a desire any person could understand, led to consequences almost beyond comprehension. His certainty of his own rightness, a trait many possess, when combined with absolute power, produced tragedy and transformation in equal measure. Or perhaps it is the questions his reign raises about power and morality. Was Henry a hero who freed England from foreign religious control, or a tyrant who murdered anyone who disagreed with him? Can we separate his achievements from his cruelties? How do we weigh the creation of the Church of England against the execution of Thomas More? The expansion of English power against the dissolution of the monasteries? The securing of the Tudor succession against the beheading of 2 wives? These questions have no easy answers. Henry himself believed he was righteous, that his actions were justified, that God supported his cause. His enemies believed he was damned, a murderer and heretic who would burn in hell. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Henry was capable of great vision and great cruelty, of political genius and personal vindictiveness, of genuine piety and shocking ruthlessness. What we can say with certainty is that Henry changed England forever. The kingdom he inherited in 1509 was medieval, Catholic, relatively weak in European politics. The kingdom he left in 1547 was on the cusp of modernity, Protestant, or at least not Catholic, increasingly powerful, fundamentally transformed in its religious, political, and social structures. Almost every major development in English history for the next 2 centuries can be traced back to decisions Henry made. The English Reformation led to religious conflicts that lasted generations, claiming thousands of lives, dividing families, shaping politics. But it also led to religious diversity, to the questioning of authority, to the idea that conscience mattered more than tradition. The expansion of Parliament led to civil war and revolution. But it also led to representative government and constitutional monarchy. The dissolution of the monasteries created suffering and loss, but it also broke feudalism and modernized the economy. Henry's personal legacy is equally complex. As a husband and father, he was often monstrous. 2 wives beheaded, 1 divorced and humiliated, 1 who died in childbirth, possibly hastened by his demands. 3 children who spent their lives shaped by his choices, dealing with the chaos he created. Yet those same children would all rule England, each in their way remarkable. He was a terrible husband and a complicated father, but the children he raised and influenced would shape their nation for decades. As a ruler, he was effective but brutal. England was stronger and more unified at his death than at his accession. But the strength was built on fear and blood. He executed more people than any English monarch before or since. He destroyed communities and traditions. He ruled through terror as much as through law. Yet the nation he left was stable enough that a 9-year-old boy could inherit the throne without immediate civil war. A remarkable achievement given England's history. 5 centuries after his death, Henry VIII remains impossible to ignore. His portrait by Holbein, legs spread wide, hands on, hips staring out with absolute confidence, is one of the most recognizable images in art. His story has been told and retold countless times, from contemporary chronicles to modern television series. His 6 wives are household names in England. His break with Rome is a defining moment in Western history. We cannot understand modern England, or by extension, the English-speaking world, without understanding Henry. The language people speak in courts of law, the prayers people say in Anglican churches, the parliamentary debates that shape legislation, the novels of English literature, the paintings in museums, the ruins scattered across the countryside, all bear his mark. He reached out from the 16th century and reshaped the future in ways even he could not have imagined. Can he, a hero, a villain, a visionary, a tyrant? The answer is yes. Henry was all of these things at different times, sometimes simultaneously. He was brilliant and brutal, charismatic and cruel, pious and murderous. He believed absolutely in his own rightness and used every tool at his disposal to impose his will on the world. The cost was measured in thousands of lives destroyed, traditions shattered, suffering inflicted. The gain was measured in a nation transformed, a church created, a future shaped. Epilogue. The king who would not be forgotten. On a cold winter morning, 8th was laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The ceremony was magnificent, befitting a king who had ruled for 38 years and transformed his kingdom utterly. 1,000 mourners followed the coffin, bells tolled across England, requiem masses were said for the king's soul. But even in death, controversy followed Henry. Legend claims that as his corpse lay in state overnight at Sion Abbey on the journey from London to Windsor, the lead coffin burst open. Dogs, it was said, came in the night and licked the blood that seeped out. Some saw it as divine judgment, God's punishment for the destruction of the monasteries and the execution of innocents. Whether the story is true or merely propaganda created by Henry's enemies is unknown. What matters is that people believed it could be true, that a king who had lived by violence might end in such a grotesque way. The 9-year-old boy who inherited Henry's throne would rule for only 6 years before dying of tuberculosis. Edward VI pushed England toward Protestantism with a fervour his father had never shown, but he left no heir. Mary I tried to reverse the Reformation, restore Catholicism, and burn heretics. She too left no heir. Elizabeth I created a lasting religious settlement and ruled for 45 glorious years. She left no heir either. The Tudor dynasty, which Henry had sacrificed so much to secure, ended with his granddaughter's death in 1603. Yet the failure of his dynasty does not mean Henry failed. His religious revolution endured. The Church of England that he created still exists, still shapes millions of lives, still holds services in churches across the globe. His expansion of Parliament's power laid the groundwork for democracy. His break with Rome opened the door to religious pluralism and freedom of conscience. His transformation of England from a medieval kingdom into an early modern state set the stage for Britain's later rise to global dominance. The cost of these achievements cannot be minimized or excused. Thousands died, directly or indirectly, because of Henry's choices. Thomas More, John Fisher, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, the monks turned out of their monasteries, the rebels hanged after the Pilgrimage of Grace, the martyrs burned under Mary, whom Henry's religious chaos had helped create. The list of victims is long and tragic. They were real people with families and hopes and fears, ground up in the machinery of Henry's will. But ignoring his achievements is equally dishonest. Love him or hate him, and people have done both for 5 centuries, Henry VIII changed the world. The modern notion that a nation can determine its own religion independent of Rome, the idea that Parliament can check royal power, the principle that law should be made through statute rather than decree, the concept of a national church, all these have roots in Henry's reign. He was not a good man by modern standards, or arguably by any standards. He was egotistical, cruel, convinced of his own righteousness to a dangerous degree. He used people and discarded them when they ceased to be useful. He could not tolerate disagreement and destroyed anyone who opposed him. He pursued his personal desires at catastrophic cost to others. Kabul because he was also brilliant, charismatic, occasionally generous, genuinely pious in his own understanding of piety, capable of inspiring loyalty even from those who knew his capacity for cruelty. He was a Renaissance prince who embodied both the best and worst of that ideal. He was cultured and savage, learned and brutal, magnificent and monstrous. History does not offer us perfect heroes or complete villains, only complicated human beings who shaped the world through their choices. Henry made choices that transformed England and, by extension, influenced the development of democracy, religious freedom, and modern governance. That these choices were often motivated by selfishness does not erase their historical significance. That he was a tyrant does not mean his reign was without achievement. The truth about Henry VIII is uncomfortable. He was a man of great gifts who used them in service of his ego and appetites. He was capable of greatness and of terrible evil. He built a new religious order on the foundations of his divorce. He secured England's independence at the cost of thousands of lives. He created a church that would endure for centuries to advance his personal interests. This paradox is what makes Henry endlessly fascinating. We cannot look away from him because he forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, morality, achievement, and cost. Can a monster create lasting good? Can we celebrate achievements built on suffering? How do we judge historical figures who operated in contexts so different from our own? These questions have no simple answers. What we can say is this: Henry VIII was one of the most consequential monarchs in English history. His reign marks the end of medieval England and the beginning of its early modern transformation. The church he created still exists. The parliament he empowered evolved into democracy. The navy he expanded became the instrument of empire. The language of the Bible he commissioned influenced English literature for centuries. The rupture with Rome he initiated led, eventually, to religious toleration. He was the king who broke an empire, the Catholic Universal Church that had dominated Europe for a millennium. In doing so, he set forces in motion that no one, including Henry himself, could control. The England that emerged from his reign was unrecognizable from the England he inherited. And from that transformed England would come democracy, industrial revolution, empire, and influence that spread across the globe. 500 years after his death, we still debate him. Historians argue about his motives and achievements. Popular culture endlessly reimagines his story. Tourists visit Windsor Castle to see his grave, Hampton Court Palace to walk where he walked, the Tower of London, where his wives died. His story has been told in hundreds of books, dozens of films, countless television series. The musical Six transforms his 6 wives into pop stars, reclaiming their narratives. The fascination endures because the story is too dramatic, too consequential, too human to forget. Henry VIII was not a hero. He was often a villain, but he was also a force of nature who reshaped his world through sheer will. He wanted a son and an annulment. He got a religious reformation and a transformed nation. History is full of such ironies. The personal becomes political, the domestic becomes cosmic. A king's divorce becomes a new church. A marriage crisis becomes constitutional revolution. In the end, we remember Henry not because he was good, but because he mattered. His choices, born of ego and desperation and certainty, echo through the centuries. The church bells that ring in Anglican churches, the prayers spoken in English rather than Latin, the parliamentary debates that shape law, the ruins of monasteries dotting the English countryside, the portrait of the king staring out with absolute confidence from Whitehall, all testify to one undeniable truth. Henry VIII lived, and England would never be the same. The golden prince who became a tyrant, the athlete who became an invalid, the faithful son of the church who became its supreme head, the husband who married 6 times seeking love and heir, the father whose children would all rule but leave no dynasty, the king who sacrificed morality for certainty and reshaped Christianity in England in the process. This was Henry. Undeniable, unforgettable, impossible to ignore. The king who broke an empire to build his own, the man whose personal crisis became England's transformation, the monarch whose legacy, for good and ill, still shapes the world. In St. George's Chapel at Windsor, a stone marks his resting place. Simple, unadorned, inadequate to the enormity of the man buried beneath. But Henry's real grave is not in that vault. It is in the world he made, the church he created, the parliament he empowered, the nation he transformed. The consequences, intended and unintended, of a will that would not bend, and a vision that demanded the world change to match it. That is the legacy of Henry VIII, not the tomb that was never built, but England itself, remade, reborn, reformed, by fire and will and blood and law, by one man's obsession and the thousands caught in its wake, by the king who would not be forgotten because he made forgetting impossible. His story ends in 1547, but what he started endures. The questions he raised about power and faith, about authority and conscience, about the individual against the system, these questions remain alive. We are still living in the world Henry helped create, still grappling with the forces he unleashed, still trying to understand the man who changed everything while trying only to secure his dynasty. The dynasty failed. But the kingdom survived, transformed, stronger and bloodied in equal measure. That is Henry's true monument, not stone and gold, but a nation remade, a church independent, a parliament empowered, a religious landscape fractured and reborn, and 5 centuries of people who cannot stop talking about the king who did it all. Henry VIII, king, tyrant, reformer, destroyer, builder, husband, father, killer, believer, monster, man. He was all of these things, and history will never let him rest.